Hello and welcome to Diegetic Advancement. My name is Riley and we're back with some more Chainmail read-through. As always, I've got a call in from the Pink Phantom. Stay tuned for that. It's great as always. And of course, I'll have to start with the usual apology for the delay or the gap in between episodes. I'll be releasing a separate podcast shortly with some more general updates, and I'll talk a little bit about that, I think. But for now, let's just jump into it. The final stretch is here, and we're looking at man-to-man combat. It's a short section, at only 3 pages, and there's a few tables that you can reference. But let's dive in. Okay, man-to-man combat. So the system is intended to be used when each figure represents a single man instead of the usual 1:20 scale, which is perfect for small battles or a castle siege. And to be honest, here I'm not sure we can call it a system. I think it's usable, but what it really is, it's a list of exceptions from the regular rules and changes to the regular rules for playing this, which I think is a good thing. It's not a different game. It's not a different system using Chainmail regularly with a couple of changes to make it work for man-to-man. We start reading though, and it instantly becomes clear that we're missing something. It starts with missile fire, and it's talking about how to determine short, medium, and long range, but why would I need to do these? What does that mean? Well, we jump back to the back of the book and look at the tables. It's not yet mentioned in the text. I'm not sure that they really are mentioned. There is a section later on that talks about the melee tables. It'd be nice. And there's a general theme with this section is that it's not formatted well. It's not laid out well. The order of things isn't great. There's some repeated rules. But let's jump back to the tables and take a look at those, because I think they are needed for context. So there are 2 main tables here, and there's a third we'll look at later that are relevant. So there's the man-to-man melee table and the individual fires with missile table. Let's look at melee first. This is perhaps the infamous weapon versus armor table. So you roll 2d6, cross-referencing your weapon versus the opponent's armor. There's a few things to note. This is obviously more granular than the previous system of light foot versus heavy foot, or the half-armored, fully armored with missile. We get 12 different weapons and 8 armor classes, and 2 additionals for when someone's on a horse. The advantage to being more granular in the options here is that different weapons can be better or worse depending on the defending armor. So the 2-handed sword is really the powerhouse. It really only ever gets beaten by a mounted lance at lighter armor classes. But we can see something like the flail is more effective against heavy armor than a sword might be. And the flail seems to ignore bonuses from shields, which is cool. Additionally, we're still looking at rolling to kill, not damage here. And there's a rule that certain weapons will have an easier time killing a prone defender in plate armor. So if you were to knock someone off their horse and they're prone, a dagger goes from needing a 12 to kill them to a 7. Then we get to the missiles. It works exactly the same, and it's kind of an extension of the table, really. You're comparing different range weapons against the same armor classes, except there's a few different changes. In each, column and row, instead of there being a single number that you need to kill, there are 3. And this is for the short, medium, and long range. That was confusing at the start. And there are cases where a unit is unkillable, which is interesting. For example, a short bow at long range cannot kill a unit in plate. Lastly, we get a rule for how cover interacts with this system. It subtracts from dice scores. Now, we'll have to read on. I went back and checked the cover rules, and soft cover simply reduces the number of shots in half. So I don't know how that carries across. We'll have to see. That's question number 1 from this, I guess. Okay, that's the tables though. Let's get back to the exceptions. I'm just going to quickly list some of the stuff that I'm reading and really only elaborate if there's something particularly interesting. Okay, so missile fire, short, medium, long is simply just dividing the total range of the weapon into thirds. Thrown weapons are treated as short bows on the table, but keep their range. Melee, there's a lot of rules here about who strikes first, and in the first round and in subsequent rounds. Luckily, we solved the round debate in the previous post. By default, the attacker is going first in the first round, unless the defender has a weapon which is 2 classes higher. And if we go back to the chart, the weapons are actually numbered, and that is explained a little bit later. Or if the defender has a height advantage, if you're fighting from the top of the wall. I have to assume that weapon class matters. The weapon class matters as it's a substitute for length and speed. Again, that's actually confirmed a little bit later. On the second round and all following rounds, the same figure goes first, except where opponent's weapon class is 2 classes lower or they have the height advantage. So unless anything changes, the same person's kind of going first. There's some rules for how rear attacks and flanking affects this. So rear attacks, you can't do a counter on that first round, and the attacker that's attacking from the rear automatically goes first on that second round as well. If you attack from specifically the left flank, you will automatically go first in the first round as well. Interesting, there's no rules. Everyone is right-handed, I suppose. There's some bonuses here for mounted men fighting non-mounted. Horses can also attack after the first round. They can kick out. And then here we get some more bonuses for rear attacks, and there's no counter strike, but that's already explained just before. As I'm saying, this section is very messy. Then we get to parrying, which is fairly complicated, at least in reading, but probably simple enough in practice. Basically, if your weapon class is roughly equivalent, it's not too much higher than the opponent's, you can sacrifice your strike with a parry, which subtracts 2 from the attacker's roll. As your weapon class gets lower relative to your opponent's, you can do things like parry and counter on a success. So if you do a successful parry, then you can attack. Scoring the original requirement in this case breaks the weapon. I'm not sure if this is after subtracting the roll. I assume it's not, because then you would break the weapon and kill the person. But it's odd that you could, in that case, because it's a -2, that you could score 1 above the original and then nothing happens. You don't break the weapon or kill the person, but I guess you've got to make a single number. Makes sense. So as your weapon class gets drastically lower, and in this case it's 8 or more classes lower, the defender gets first blow and can parry the second. Now I get some assumptions wrong here, because again, there's some vital information later in this 3-page document. So I assume that the second strike would be the attacker's, right? That kind of makes sense. Or he can strike the second, which I guess would put the attacker on the third. I'm not sure. In this case, the parry is only a -1. And there's a note here that certain weapons still go first on a charge, which is pikes, spears, and lances. So particularly long weapons can negate this advantage. Now, as I said, all my confusion around that is resolved in the next section. So if a weapon is 4 classes lower, they strike twice in a round. Whilst if there are 8 classes lower, they strike 3 times. So when the parrying section is talking about replacing, like if you want to attack on the second or parry on the second, it's the second of your 3 attacks, which that would have been nice to know before you got to parrying. Anyway, the odd formatting continues here because we get more rules about mounted men fighting unmounted men, and it's simply a repeat of the rule that is above, where there's a bonus and a penalty. But there is some more rules here. So you can unhorse a man if you state that specifically as your goal rather than attacking, and then you score a successful hit. You ignore the usual penalties for attacking a mounted man, so that would knock him off. And then you roll a d6 to see if it also stuns them. And it's either no stun, 1 turn, or 3 turns, depending on what. Lastly, there's leaders get +1 on all dice. Fair enough. And they are considered to be in the best armor class that would be available to them. And there's a special rule for Vikings, roughly what you'd expect. So they can fight in the nude and still get a count as having an armor class, and they obviously rush into combat. So that's the bulk of man-to-man meleeing and some missile stuff. Then we get to jousts, and this is kind of a fun little mini game, I guess. And I'll have to get this to the table one day. It'd be cool to run a jousting tournament, though I believe the game is basically has a solution, a set of moves that you can do to basically guarantee a win. So maybe there's a better version out there that's a little bit more balanced. But basically this allows you to play out a joust, either a single joust or a tournament. And referring to the third table that I mentioned earlier, each player selects an aiming point and a position in the saddle, which is sort of how they're going to defend. And then you compare these and find out the result. Have you broken your lance? Have you unhorsed them? Yada, yada. And you just continue this process back and forth until one rider has been unhorsed, or you've done it 3 times. And there's a scoring system if you wanted to have a tournament with few ties. You could just say you need to unhorse them to win, but things like breaking lances and stuff will score points if you want to get a little bit more granular. So pretty cool. Yep. And then we get to point costs. So there's nothing terribly exciting here at first glance, and then I remember something. So we get a list of point costs. I would assume these are for man-to-man, being in that section, but we get rules for bombards and heavy catapults. So I think these are just general points for the whole game. Again, weird formatting here. And we don't have points yet in the rest of the book, so I'm going to assume that these are just general points for Chainmail. And there is something here. Now that I'm seeing that there are bombards and heavy catapults, what we get here in point costs is a list of units and their costs, and additional costs, weapons that cost additional points. So to arm your Lightfoot with pikes would cost an additional point. But this is where the section, catapults and bombards are listed in this section. So we've already kind of answered this, but how many men are manning a catapult? Well, you first buy the Lightfoot, and then you add a catapult to them, right? And so they maintain that 1:20 figure. So there you go. All right, let's wrap it up. So there is one new question here, which is how does cover work in man-to-man? Because it's talking about you just use the penalties as normal. From my reading so far, I haven't seen any penalties that would apply like that, with the cover sort of just halving shots. You can't halve a single shot, so I don't know. Make it up, I guess. And we kind of get a little bit more clarity on how catapults are manned. Points values were something that I was looking for. I hadn't brought that up, but we see them here. Again, it's a little bit unclear if they're meant to be just for man-to-man or not. And maybe they are. There's no point cost anywhere else, but there might just be the intention that you are playing historical battles, and so you just take an army that makes sense, and you first an opposing army that makes sense. You don't worry about points. And that's certainly a way to play. But I believe at the start, in the preface, it's talking about balancing games and giving your opponent additional points if you're a better player and things like that. So I assume that this is for Chainmail generally. There's some nice things here that I think will become quite relevant as we get to OD&D proper. Obviously, if you know OD&D, the Just table is relevant. But I think there's a couple of things that we'll come back to and see how they're used as we go forward. So next week, we're on the last section, the fantasy supplement, starting on page 28. And I will be reading up to, not including spell complexity, on page 33. That's like a paragraph before we get to there on page 33. I think that leaves us 3 episodes, including the next one. So it'll be that, and then I think there's almost 10 pages left after that, a little bit less. So I'll probably split those into 2 as well. Okay, that's it for me. So I will let Pink Phantom share his thoughts. I'll make any comments after listening, and we'll close out.
All right, this is the Pink Phantom. Man-to-man combat in Chainmail. So reading through the man-to-man, this looks basically to be just specifics and exceptions listed to build on the mass combat system. And most of the rules are concentrating on which person in the combat strikes first. And most of it is focused around the types of weapons. Each weapon has a class, and the class seems to combine essentially size and speed, weapon size and weapon speed, with the longer weapon striking first in the first round, and then the remaining rounds, it's the smaller, faster weapon. And if it's small enough, you may get 2 blows or even 3 blows in. And then there's a series of rules about whether or not the defender in any given attack can attempt to parry. And if they parry, or depending on the attack roll or the parry, they could have a weapon breakage of the parrying weapon. And it could also give the defender an opportunity to counterattack For missile fire, it divides missile ranges into 3 ranges: short, medium, and long. And then everything essentially references at the back of the book the man-to-man charts and the man-to-man missile weapon charts. The man-to-man charts cross-reference the weapon class, size/speed versus the various types of armor there can be. It's interesting when talking about mounted versus unmounted. There's the mounted gets to add +1 to the dice for melees. The unmounted combatant has to subtract 1 from their melee dice, which, depending on what class of unit it is, type of foot unit, the type of a horse unit that are fighting, it may not be possible for the foot unit to actually hit the attacker because they need a 6, and if they're having to subtract 1, they obviously can't get a 6 on the die. But this is alleviated somewhat by if they get the specific attack and they say they're striking to unhorse, you can unhorse with the specific. If you get the roll you need to hit, even if you're subtracting 1 from the die after you make the roll. If the roll is hits, you can unhorse someone with it. Now you have to make the determination that you're going to unhorse before rolling the dice. So that gives footmen an opportunity to dismount a horseman and then have an opportunity to actually get a kill on the next round of combat. And then we get an even more specific rule about jousting and how to conduct jousts and scoring jousts. And then at the end of all of that, there are point values for units and for adding weapons to units. And of course, even more specifics for specific types of units. For example, mercenaries cost half points, or the Swiss and Landsknecht that we've had such difficulty saying, that they're equivalent to heavy foot and that sort of thing. So now in the past, I have used these point values for setting up mass battle, getting roughly equivalent sides for mass battle. It's interesting that it's at the end of the man-to-man section, because does that mean that this is just for if you're doing individual troops and not for units of troops, the 1-to-10 or 1-to-20 ratio figures? But it seems like something that could apply either way. So in total, it seems like these 3 pages are a lot of very specific, very detailed rules for making changes to the mass combat system to situations where you have a figure equals 1 individual instead of a group of 10 or a group of 20. And this introduces a weapon versus armor combat, whereas before in the mass combat it was simply troop type versus troop type. And weapon versus armor, what type of armor a unit had really only seemed to matter in terms of determining casualties from missile fire in the mass combat section. So a short little section, and really for the amount of rules, it doesn't really cover a lot. It's really just, seems to take a lot of details and steps to adjudicate a very handful of things that change between man-to-man and mass combat. But it is interesting from, this point in history, now 50 years from the development of this game, seeing the influences for the early versions of D&D and AD&D with weapon length, weapon speed, and weapon versus armor adjustments being part of some of those early games. So very interesting. I've never put it into practical use, so on the tabletop, so I can't really comment on how well it works, or maybe what kind of holes or gaps there are in it where there are questions to exactly how it works. I think because it is so detailed about a handful of things, it's actually pretty comprehensive in what it attempts to cover. I don't see on, a read through that there's any specific holes or questions that pop to mind that need to be answered. Maybe you see something. So anyway, that's it for Man to Man.
And thank you very much for the call. Please go check out Pink Phantom's show. I really appreciate your contributions as always. And Pink Phantom's doing some really interesting stuff over on his show with some AD&D solo play, which I think is quite unique. So if you haven't checked that out, please do. I think you'll enjoy it. Yeah, we don't find too much different from each other. There's not a whole lot to find here. Thanks for calling out that, yes, the penalty for the mounted unit is interesting in that it can make a mounted unit invulnerable to certain types of weapons because they're getting a -1. And a thought occurred to me that, yes, where that's the case, you will need to try to unhorse the man. And if you've got a dagger, let's say, and I don't have the table in front of me, so I don't know what the score would be, but let's just say that you do. I assume, and you're 8 classes lower, so you're getting 3 attacks. I assume you can unhorse, and then the next 2 attacks are going to be against the prone target. So now you only need a 7, assuming they're in plate, right? Because they're a knight. So that's quite interesting. That if you do get unhorsed by a dagger, you're in trouble, especially on the first attack, because then they've probably got 2 more attacks to try and get a 7. So that's a kind of a cool system there. I didn't mention the extra point costs for the special troop types, so thanks for calling those out. Yeah, mercenaries are cheaper, and the impossible to pronounce Landsknecht and Swiss get some extra point costs there and whatnot. Again, that completely confuses me. Surely there's more than 2 special units that deserve some representation, but again, I'm not a historian, so I don't know. Yeah, good point on the mass battle points. I'm not sure. Same conclusion as you, whether or not they're meant to be used for the mass battle. I think they probably are. As I said, there's some references to points earlier very early on in the document. There's no other points, so you have to use these. Good to hear that you've used them. So that makes sense. Yeah, so the only thing, as you said, it's not much here, and it's fairly comprehensive in what it does cover. And I think because it's simply exceptions and additions to the rules that are already presented, it doesn't need, there are no gaps that don't already exist in the rules, right? Because if there's a gap in these rules, you go back to how it's done in mass battle and you lean on that. The only gap here that I can see is how does cover work, and maybe I just need to go back and then have a closer look at the cover rules to find where that penalty is. But yeah, as I said, the only thing that I can see is that soft cover is halving the number of shots, which doesn't make sense. I can't apply that to a penalty to a single die roll. Oh no, it is 2d6, but I don't think the intention is to roll a single 6. I don't think you'll ever hit. And then heavy cover, just you're invulnerable, so that doesn't make any sense either. But as I said, maybe it's in there somewhere. Call in and let me know if you know how that's meant to work. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Again, sorry for the delay. I am already writing my thoughts down for the next section so that I can try and get that out on time. But as always, thank you very much for listening. Pink Phantom, thanks for the call. We've got 3 more episodes focusing on Chainmail left, and then we get into outdoor survival. I'm not sure how in depth I'll go into that because I don't think it plays a huge role in the evolution of D&D. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure what the rulebook even looks like or how long it is, so I will tackle that when we get there. And with that, bye for now.